All right. All right, everybody, let's go ahead and get started. It's a couple minutes after noon. Thanks to everybody from signing on. We have quite a few people who've joined us today. I'm Janet McCabe. I'm Director of Policy and Implementation at IU's Environmental Resilience Institute. I want to welcome you to the first community webinar for 2019. This is a series of monthly webinars. Today we're going to focus on community vulnerability assessments, and we have two excellent speakers to talk about that. We're recording today's webinar, and a copy will be accessible on the ERI website. So if you know somebody who wasn't able to join us today, you can let them know about that. Or you can rewatch this webinar as many times as you like and re-enjoy the experience. Given the number of people we have on the webinar, we've muted everybody's audio, and we'll have time for questions at the end. If you have an urgent question during the presentations, go ahead and send a question through the chat function and we can keep track of it. You can hover your mouse over the Zoom window and you'll see the chat option pop up and you can click on that. We're pleased to offer this webinar series. It's one thing universities can do well is to bring people together for learning and bring experts to share their information and expertise. And we always welcome your suggestions for how to make this a more useful experience and what topics to cover in the area of environmental resilience and climate change. Today in particular, I think vulnerability assessments are a very timely topic as my colleague Andrea Webster and I go around the state talking to community resilience, sustainability, and other staff, local government staff and others. We're hearing a lot about cities wanting to do vulnerability assessments, wanting to understand where the risks are in their communities related to environmental change and climate change. There's a lot going on nationally and, as you'll hear from our speakers, in the Midwest and in Indiana, and lots of opportunities for folks. So let me quickly say a word about our two speakers. Jason Cervenec, who will go first, is the Education and Outreach Director for the Byrd Polar and Climate Research Center at Ohio State University. And the most common request for information that he receives from the public is on climate change. He led the City of Columbus, Ohio's Climate Change Action Plan Task Force that recently released the Columbus Climate Adaptation Plan, and he's going to talk about that experience. Dr. Missy Stults is responsible for ensuring that Ann Arbor, Michigan meets its climate and sustainability goals. She worked on the Adaptation Chapter for the U.S. National Climate Assessment, so brings a very broad set of experiences to this topic. She was the National Climate Director for the ICLEI Local Governments for Sustainability, where she worked with over 600 local governments to advance their climate mitigation, adaptation, and sustainability efforts. So we're very lucky to have these two experts with us today. I want to, let's see, Orion, I'm not seeming to be able to advance the slides. How do I do that? There we go. All right, I don't know what you did there. We have a lot of folks joining us today. Which is great. I want to thank our co-hosts for this series, Accelerate Indiana Municipalities, which, as many of you know, is a statewide organization that supports municipal governments in Indiana, and also the Association of Indiana Counties similarly provides a lot of support for county governments throughout Indiana. Just to remind everybody and tell everybody who might be new to this, the Environmental Resilience Institute at IU, which is part of the Prepared for Environmental Change Grand Challenge, has a number of programs that we manage or help deliver to provide assistance to local governments. In particular, I want to mention the 2019 Resilience Cohort and let you know this is the program that is run out of the Sustainability Office here at IU that provides summer interns to communities and other organizations to work on resilience and climate change projects. We have a special project this year where we're able to fund up to 10 communities or even maybe more, to prepare in coordination with ICLEI a greenhouse gas inventory, community greenhouse gas inventory. And I'm just thrilled that we had 11 cities apply to be part of that cohort. And we had 10 other requests for interns from county or city government. And that's more than we've had in prior years. So way to go, Indiana cities and towns. I'm really thrilled. We'll be looking at those applications. We may not be able to fund them all, but we're gonna do our best to try. So I'm going to turn it over now to Jason and let him, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and let him start sharing his screen and we'll get going. Jason, take it away. We're gonna have to unmute.
Okay, is the audio better now?
We can hear you now.
Okay, so
But
I apologize.
But I think we don't have your slides up. We have a different document. There we go.
Okay. So I apologize in advance. I'm getting over, and my entire family is getting over a cold. So hopefully my voice isn't too raspy. So I'm the Education Outreach Director at the Center. I wear a number of different hats here, but I'll speak today specifically on the work we did as a team to collaborate with the City of Columbus and our Regional Planning Authority to create a risk and vulnerability report for the city. And then subsequently, I'll just mention some of the work we took to translate that into an adaptation plan. And then I'll take some, obviously, questions. And Missy's I'm gonna speak very specifically about Columbus, and she'll speak a little bit more generally about some other initiatives and things you can tap into. I think one of the few takeaways from today is to remember that there's a lot of ways to go about doing this work, and so there isn't a one-size-fits-all. The other one to realize is a lot of things, ours has been a 4.5-year process, but there's a lot of things that are available now that weren't when we started, that are off the shelf. And so it's a lot easier to do this process than it would have been 5 years ago when we first started brainstorming what to do. So obviously the climate's changing in the Midwest. This graphic on the left is a bit outdated at this point, but our winters by end of century will look much more like Virginia and the Carolinas, and our summers more like the panhandle of Texas. That's kind of what I talk about in scientific circles and in some of our work with this. But what makes my phone ring off the hook is when we get news reports that come out that discuss things like the Buckeye tree not being able to survive in Ohio and being much more prolific in Michigan in the future. And so I field a range of calls that come in here. To kind of set the stage, municipal government around the country is faced with different issues. I think the Midwest has begun doing adaptation work a little bit later because maybe the threats weren't as imminent or as pronounced as early on. Norfolk, Virginia, we know has rising tides, and that's causing, with that and storm surge, them to have to do some work. We've seen the fires out in the western U.S., although Ontario, just north of us, had significant forest fires this year, and I know with the recent National Climate Assessment, southeastern Ohio could face this threat in the future. My brother lives in Houston, and flooding there. We've also seen regional and localized flooding in the Midwest. And then something that I think brought home what the costs are and the effects on the insurance industry and also finance that really resonated a bit in Columbus was bond ratings. And Moody's in November 29th of 2017 came out with a report that said the bond ratings of municipalities and local governments will be tied to climate risks and what steps they've taken to make themselves more resilient. We've also seen a lawsuit that was filed by Farmers Insurance against the city of Chicago. And so we're starting to see these effects in the Midwest be more pronounced, and realizing that local government oftentimes is the first thing that citizens will call before they call the Fed or call their state. We'll look to see what the local government is doing. I also wanted to set the stage by what steps can be taken. We can look at climate mitigation, so stopping or limiting climate change impacts, or reversing greenhouse gas emissions, something a little bit more complicated. We are already going to see some impacts of climate change, even if we mitigate to a large extent. So adaptation is necessary, altering not just the physical environment, but our behaviors to prepare for the changes that are already here, and those will subsequently arrive over the next 50 to 100 years. And the last option is really where nobody wants to find themselves, which is if you fail to mitigate and adapt, the default is to suffer. And vulnerable populations will be those that suffer most because they have the fewest resources to deal with those changes. And so with this backdrop in mind, I can kind of set the stage for the work that's been done in Columbus over the last 4.5 years. There's a roadmap that we followed, and this is really brought to our attention by GLISA, which is at the University of Michigan. they service the Midwestern region or the Great Lakes region, but since there's no other NOAA center that supported our region of the country, they fortunately took us on. And our risk and vulnerability piece was done with GLISA, the city of Columbus, and a team here at Ohio State. This U.S. Climate Resiliency Toolkit has come out with a 5-step process that you can follow. Step 1 is explore your climate threats. 2, assess your vulnerabilities and risks. That's really the first 2 years of our work to develop a risk and vulnerability report. Subsequently, steps 3 and 4, we're investigating our options and prioritizing those options. That was a 2-year process that followed it. And then the last step is really City Council and the Mayor of Columbus deciding what actions they want to take from our prioritized list. So if you go to the U.S. Climate Resiliency Toolkit, you can find a bunch of case studies and tools to help with this. I'll mention a few other ones, and Missy will mention some as well. I wouldn't visit that site now because in checking today, I didn't realize that's a NOAA site and it's currently offline. So I know there's some data sets that are unavailable right now, but that site is also currently offline with the shutdown. So what I've done with all my slides on the lower right-hand side is I've put that 5-step process so you can see exactly how each of our steps along the path dovetail with that 5-step process. The graphic at the top really gives you the process we went through with GLISA and the city. The funding for ours was actually from a local foundation, and it was from Natural Resources Defense Council that helped do the adaptation or the risk and vulnerability report, and then the university gave some kind of pro bono time to do it. Columbus has a few hundred, about 800,000 people in the city and probably 1.5 in the metro area or more. We're expected to add 1 million people by 2050, so it is a relatively large area with a pretty big population. Our first step was on the left side of the screen looking at climate change, and GLISA identified 2 changes that would be most pronounced in our area, which was rising temperatures and increasing precipitation. That temperature increase isn't uniform throughout the year. It's more in the winter and more at night that we're seeing that warming. And also the increased precipitation isn't just an increased precipitation, it's also more variability. So we're seeing more dry spells punctuated by heavy downpours that give us these intense rainfall events that are causing localized flooding and a lot of nutrients from farm fields to end up in our waterways. GLISA also went ahead and figured out climate impacts. And these are the other bullet points you can see on the list: longer growing season, deteriorating air quality, all the way down to changing seasonal precipitation and changes to water availability. And they started the conversation at that point because this was information that the atmospheric sciences and meteorology community could really bring to bear. I understand from in Indiana, Purdue might be able to provide some information because this data, this information largely is going to be uniform for the entire region or the entire state. And so what we did in Columbus is really going to be generalizable to the rest of Ohio. Following that process, we brought a number of people together in in-person meetings. These were technical experts that had background information in specific disciplines. In small groups, we gave them each of these and we asked them to unpack what are the vulnerabilities that could result from each of these impacts. And just asked them to, over a 2.5-hour session, dump all the information they had. Our team then went ahead and went through that list and reduced duplication, improved verbiage, but got it down to a much more tightly constrained list that captured all of the vulnerabilities that the technical experts were saying we're going to see in the region. Now, these are technical experts, not the University of Michigan. They're actually located in Central Ohio. So everywhere from engineers and water resource managers for people that are working with food systems and those working with engineering specifications. So we wanted to have a diverse group of people in the room. Once that process happened and we got the list ratcheted down a bit, we engaged that group of stakeholders, technical experts, and a larger group of stakeholders to take that list and rank items. And we asked them to rank things on each item on 2 different continua. One was sensitivity. So how much directly or indirectly is a system in Columbus going to be impacted by this climate condition? Obviously, some things that are really sensitive are a concern to us. There's other things that won't be as sensitive and we wouldn't have to worry about as much. The other continuum was capacity. Are there things that we have a lot of capacity to adapt to? We've got staff on the ground, we've got resources there, the will to do something about it. And there are other things that we have less capacity and we have to be very worried about those. Now, when I put these 2 terms on the screen, that might not mean a lot, but I have a graphic that I think captures it a little bit better. So this is if you plot things. Sensitivity, obviously, on the kind of the x-axis here. Things that you're low sensitive to, we're not too worried about. Things that your community is really sensitive to are a concern. on the, that's the x-axis. On the y-axis, there's adaptive capacity. Things that you can adapt to and you have high adaptive capacity, we don't worry about too much. Things that we have low adaptive capacity, we can't really respond to with the resources we have on the ground are more of a concern. And so what you see this creates is a matrix with the upper right hand being red, things that are of great concern because we're very sensitive, we don't have a lot of ability to respond. And on the lower left hand, things that are not as sensitive and we don't have as much ability, we have a lot more ability to respond to. And we plotted all of these items on this matrix. Now, an example of one, harmful algal blooms are a concern in central Ohio and throughout the state. So we asked our experts, where would this fall on the matrix if we went and plotted it? So it's something which we're relatively sensitive to, and we don't tend to have a lot of adaptive capacity on the ground right now. So one of the things that kind of fell to the top of our prioritized list was our response to harmful algal blooms and being able to provide fresh drinking water for people. In comparison, we could compare that to something else, recreation and tourism and impact on water quality and recreational quality. So if we plot that, we're a little less sensitive to it. We also have a little bit greater adaptive capacity, and so that's plotted in black here. So you can compare those two. You can imagine in our process doing this, anything that fell into the green or the light green really were things we're not worried about. We realize Columbus has limited time and resources, so we really want to focus on the upper right area, the area that's red and light orange, and things that fall on the left are not as important, things we're not going to prioritize as highly. So we had a list then, but the list had to go through one more refinement. And this is the risk assessment. Just because we're vulnerable to something doesn't necessarily mean it's a risk for us. So this is kind of vulnerability. I mentioned we were looking at the sensitivity and adaptive capacity. So what is risk? Risk is looked at by two different variables. It's looked at by the likelihood something will occur and the severity of that event if it occurs. Now you might say, well, how do I kind of conceptualize that? I have a good way to conceptualize it. If anybody's ever been to Glacier National Park, there's a highline trail that runs up along the side of a cliff. You can see right here, it's about 3 feet wide, but there's about 1,000-foot fall to your left. So the likelihood of you falling is pretty low. So the chance of that event happening pretty low. But the consequence is really, really high if you do. Compare that to you decide to do a race through a field and you want to do a blindfolded race. The consequence of falling is very low there. The likelihood of falling is pretty high. So your chance of falling high, but the consequence low. Imagine what that looks like if we combine our blindfolded race on this cliff, walking on this cliff trail, right? Consequence high, chance of falling high. Those are things you're very worried about. You don't want to combine those two because that's going to be the highest risk things and the things Columbus would be most worried about. And so that's kind of a way to capture how you multiply the consequence by the likelihood. The likelihood we allowed the University of Michigan to come up with, the likelihood of some of these events like floods happening. The consequence we actually turned to local professionals because they would understand if this happens, what's it going to mean for the local population and our local response. And when we did that, we actually calculated those. We came up with a score. This gave us our final list, prioritized list. We started the process with 2 climate change changes, the precipitation and temperature. GLESA provided us with that. They also provided us with the climate impacts. But after we involved the stakeholders and the technical experts in our local population, we then came down with 14 items that sifted to the top of our list as the biggest vulnerabilities for the city of Columbus, and everything that our adaptation plan should map to. Like I mentioned, this took a little under 2 years to do. We came out with the report, and then following that, I stepped into the role of doing an adaptation plan. This adaptation plan came out in November of this year, so it's available online, and I can share that link at the end. We did have a green team that helped us decide the focus of it. We only focused on adaptation, so our plan doesn't include climate mitigation. That's a separate initiative the city of Columbus is doing. When we started this process out, we had a roundtable and actually had ideas generated. We started with 430 items. Anybody realizes if you have a task list of 430 items, nothing's going to happen. You'll find out when we're done, we have 43, and those are ranked into 2 different bins. Critical ones of about 20 some critical items, and then lesser items or aspirational items, which there's about 20 of. And those can be distributed across city government and some community partners that we have. We did a reduction of that list. We engaged a bunch of technical experts. You can see by this point, we're not just investigating options, we're starting to prioritize those actions. Our center at the university helps run the statistics on these. you can imagine when you start doing stakeholder engagement, there's different ways to get numbers from these technical experts, and you're always worried when you get average values that could be a result of everybody saying the same thing, everybody giving it a rank of 3 versus everybody giving it a rank of a 5 and a 1, and having to figure out, are there different experts that have different understanding of this system? So we had to do a lot of statistics and engaging stakeholders to make sure that the numbers and what we were drawing as conclusions were accurate from the technical expert standpoint. We drafted our text by October of 2017, and then following a public comment period, we found out that city government actually looked more closely at the document once we made it public. And there was a lot of feedback that came from different people in city government and different agencies that then resulted in us having to beef up parts of the document and making sure we tied in additional existing resources that had already been written. And our plan came out in October, actually in December of this year. We were a little bit later than we thought we'd be. And this is what the full document looks like. Everything from extreme heat and air quality to emergency preparedness and vulnerable populations, including an unpacking of how we came up with the document. And this is serving Columbus, but we've also had a number of neighboring counties want to get copies of this because it informs their work, including our emergency management agency and our public health agency. And so it's been actually, it's an educating agencies outside of Central Ohio. I showed you that 5-step process is important to follow, but I also want to point out that there's a new model which has been proposed, which is really resilience planning becoming more of a cyclic process. So we're now in a point where we'll probably be updating this document every 5 years. So this is more of the model it looks like as we revisit these documents based on our response and additional data to improve them over time. So this is the model we'll be following from here on out. A few lessons we've learned in closing out: make sure that you mold the process to your context. This doesn't have to be a 4-year process. There's a lot more that's happened since then. Know what you have the ability to do and use a lot of existing resources that are already online and you can tap into. Know what your deliverables are up front and how to resolve differences. City government's different than universities, different than nonprofits. There's different pushes and pull points there, so be aware of those and conscious and open about them. Understand the limits of what you can deliver. If you have a group of volunteers, it's very different than a team like ours where we were tasked to build this document. If you have a lot of engagement from regional government, then some of the work and chapters can be written by them, and that might make it easier on the team that's trying to bring consistency to everything. I mentioned some of the your pushes and pull factors and appreciate those differences. Stakeholder engagement's important. Figure out what that's going to be. Our document was made better by stakeholder engagement, and that was stakeholders, technical experts, and allowing the general public, many of who had special expertise, to weigh in on stuff and give feedback. And then it's an imperfect and messy process, but the important part is starting and doing it and having a product that can start the informational process to educate nonprofits, churches, school districts, local government, businesses, individuals, as opposed to deferring it because it just seems like an arduous process. You can always revisit stuff later, but it's good to have a starting point in taking that first step. And with that, I will close out my portion.
Great. Thank you so much, Jason. A very involved process, and I'm sure you're very glad that it's over now. So with that, let's shift over to Missy, who will provide a little bit broader perspective on a number of different things that communities can and have done. So Missy, go ahead and share your screen, and we'll turn it over to you.
All right, can you guys see the screen? I've got too many things open here.
We can see the screen and your notes for the next slide. There you go.
Oh, okay, let me fix this here. Sorry about that. Always fun using 2 computer screens, and it looks like it's going to be tricky. So bear with me for 1 second. Well, what I want to say while I just fix what's happening on my screen is that I am really excited to be here, and I applaud everything Jason said. I think is essential. I wanted to highlight a few tools for you, and I might start there. But I want to pick up on points by saying that this process is messy, that there is no right or wrong way to do it, and really that importance of contextualizing to your place is pretty essential. So I might be a little creative here and do my own adapting since my computer is being tricky. You're gonna see kind of the notes and the journey. So apologies for that while my computer beast is a little tricky here. So here's what I wanted to say. There are different ways to look at vulnerability, right? So you can come at vulnerability from a natural systems perspective, right? Maybe you're really, really concerned about a set ecosystem or a series of ecosystems, or maybe you're really thinking about people and places, or maybe you want to think about the economy, and this is all fine. So figuring out kind of front and center how you want to scope your vulnerability assessment. There is no right or wrong answer to how you do that, but it is different depending on how you frame that. And let me just give you an example of what I mean when I say it's different about your framing. This is a look at some analysis that we did when I was finishing up my PhD. I worked and consulted for a number of foundations, and a foundation asked to get a sense of the adaptation landscape. And so they asked us to look at 80 organizations, the largest 80 players in the field around climate, and to understand all of the tools, services, or resources that those organizations provided to help local or regional governments prepare for climate change. And so we did this analysis, and we looked at all of their tools and resources by that phase of the adaptation planning cycle, that circular cycle you saw, whether it's about engaging stakeholders, doing a vulnerability assessment, planning, implementing a plan, or monitoring and evaluating. And then we also broke it down by sector, because sometimes there are sector-specific information. And this is just a very ugly little chart that shows you what we came out with when we classified them. Over 1,400 distinct resources that were created to help you just do a vulnerability assessment. So if you've ever felt like this landscape is confusing and you don't know where to start, here's some data to validate that. There's a lot that's out there. So on that, doing the thing I probably shouldn't do, you've heard about, Jason mentioned the Climate Resilience Toolkit, and again, sadly, you can't see much because it's a NOAA site right now, but I do want to show you 2 other sites that you may want to take a peek at, not necessarily because they're going to have everything you need right now, but because of the methodology. We're throwing a lot at you, so if you want to take a step back and go kind of look at some resources available, here's one. And this is work that the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Index did around urban adaptation. And so here you could search for your city, and these are only the largest cities in Indiana. I think we came out with only 3 of them in Indiana have their data in here, but you could still look at the methodology, which I think is what's valuable. You could check on, in this case, we'll look at South Bend, and you can look at information specifically compiled. This is national level data, so you might have better data, but again, a sneak peek, kind of a snapshot of some information that is relevant to understanding your risk towards different climate factors, as well as your readiness. So in this case, looking at flood, you can get information here about flood risk. So just like Jason spoke about, you can get different variables around sensitivity, adaptive capacity, and exposure. Exposure is that first lens that you look at. You know, it's kind of a yes, no, are we even exposed to whatever it is we're talking about? And then you can get scores to understand how you perform on those variables. And you could, of course, change between cold, heat, sea level rise, depending on where you are. Of course, that could be relevant because this is a national tool, and drought. And you can also get variables on readiness, kind of the other side. So yes, the climate is changing, and it's not changing in the future, it's changing right now. And of course, it will continue to change. So how ready are we for that? And so here are different variables to help you think about what can be done to start preparing. So again, this is a national level tool. Many of you probably have much finer resolution data than this, but if you don't, or if you just want to look at how others are thinking about understanding their risk, their vulnerability, and their readiness, I'd point you towards this Notre Dame tool here. Another tool that just came out, and this is one that I worked on with some colleagues here in the Great Lakes region, and we just exported throughout the Midwest, is a tool that's intentionally meant to integrate socioeconomic considerations, aka people, into vulnerability assessments. So let me just pick for fun. Let's go for Indianapolis. And so what this tool does, it'll just take a second to load, but on the right panel, when it does load, you're going to see climate projections specifically for the location that was identified. Our goal is to expand this so that any community in the Midwest and Great Lakes region has their data in here. So if you are interested in this tool, please let us know, because the methodology is really easy to transport. So on the right, we have the climate projection specifically for Indianapolis. And then on the left, it's broken down by census tract, as you can see, but there are variables focused on socio and economic considerations, and then local landscape features. So let me just give you an example here. You could click through, and you can find the census tract that has different percentages of families living in poverty, for example. So let's say I'm doing a project, and I really want to know where I've got at least 10% of the population living, or families in that census tract living in poverty. And I also want to look at where I've got children in those households, because households are families in poverty, right? I might have, that could be 18-year-olds, but I want to know where we've got a certain percentage of kids under 5 living in those households. Now, this might tell me for targeted outreach, I've got limited money and limited staff capacity to do a program, so I want to target these areas because this is my primary constituency. And maybe I'm really concerned in this case about flooding, and so I want to understand where I've got high impervious surface in those areas. So I'm going to look at places that have at least 50% impervious surface as well, or 51, because that's where my browser stopped. And now I just whittled my list down. So this is sort of a planning tool. It can be a community engagement tool, but the entire point is to kind of take a lot of that stuff we talked about a vulnerability assessment, and just to make it really visual and fast. So how do you very quickly target the people in a place that may be most vulnerable to a given impact, be that flooding or extreme heat, which are what we're looked at through this tool. So I just wanted to make sure you knew that, because I know your brains are probably getting really, really satiated with a lot of information, and sorry for seeing all of my pop-ups on my computer screen here. So I want to give you that, and then I want to talk to you a bit about how people are actually using this information. So I want to give you some context here that a vulnerability assessment, as we said, can look a lot of different ways. And what matters is thinking about upfront, what's the scale? Are you focused only on internal operations? Are you focused on a certain neighborhood? Are you focused on the whole community or maybe the whole region? And all of that is perfectly fine, but you do want to try to determine what your scope is. And then second, you can do a vulnerability assessment, you can do a risk assessment, or you can do both, as Jason outlined. And again, not a right or wrong, but you do kind of want to understand where you want to draw your line, because it'll influence the process you go through and, of course, what your outcomes actually become. And then there are different methods that you can do. You can do something very qualitative, right, to start, and that can still give you very good information to at least initiate some of your efforts. You can do something very quantitative, or you can do something that focuses on thresholds, which might be a combination of quantitative and qualitative. And instead of just throwing those words at you, I want to give you some examples around the nation of what this looks like in practice. So here is an example of vulnerability assessment that was done at the 1854 ceded territory up in northern Minnesota. And again, I'm sorry this isn't live. When you get the slides, you'll be able to click through and see the animations. But basically what here was taking place is this is a number of bands of the Chippewa, and they were very, very concerned about climate change and its impacts on natural systems. And they had already started to see many of those impacts come to fruition. And so they decided to do a vulnerability assessment focused exclusively on natural systems, with, towards the end, a little bit of people kind of making their way into that. And so they brought together the 3 different bands and a number of other stakeholders, and they went through a process of really visualizing similar. This is the same chart that you saw Jason pull up, understanding the sensitivity of their primary kind of core species, and then the adaptive capacity of those species. And going through that process, this was fairly qualitative. They were able to come up with these scores for sensitivity and adaptive capacity, and then they could map things. And this gave them a sense of where they were going to prioritize in terms of developing an adaptation plan. And so everything in the red certainly made it into their adaptation plan. But there were also very core species that fell in this yellow and even in this light green area that still really mattered to their cultural identity. And so they decided they would actually plan for those as well. And in the case of things in the green, it might have been planning for the fact that they could be slight climate winners, or it might be that they just wanted to monitor those species to make sure they don't tip into the yellow area. So it may not have been as aggressive of an action identified, but they were still really, really important things for them to be concerned about, and so they didn't want to lose them, if that makes sense. So this actually was a fairly qualitative assessment. Everyone was an expert in their own way. We had fisheries folks who were experts in fisheries filling this table out, but we didn't go through a really rigorous analytical process because it wasn't particularly relevant for what we were trying to get to as an outcome. In contrast, the city of Indianapolis has just completed a draft vulnerability assessment, and this is a really fabulous quantitative kind of look at vulnerability. And it overlays a lot of different factors. So in this case, they're pulling those social variables to understand where you might have elderly populations, where you might have youth, where you have populations with higher hospitalization rates, for example. And then you overlay that with information, in this case, about air quality. right? So where do you have areas that are, through monitoring, we know have low air quality. And so you can start correlating where you've got low or poor air quality and where you've got elderly populations or youth who are really, really susceptible to the impacts of poor air quality. And that gives you very quantitative information or actionable information to understand, like we did in that previous example with the Headwaters economics tool, where you're going to target your outreach on this particular issue, because now you know what census tracts are popping. So this is a different approach. This is a data-heavy approach. There's a lot of methodology behind it, and there's some GIS analysis that has to take place, but also a fabulous way to look at vulnerability. And here's yet another way to take a look at it. Oh, goodness. You don't want to read that email. In Miami, Oklahoma, this is a community that is really forward-looking, but also very conservative. And so climate change is not a conversation starter, it's a conversation stopper in a lot of areas. And so in working with Miami, Oklahoma, what we knew was that they were experiencing really significant extreme weather impacts. We knew they were related to climate change, but we also knew that we couldn't go through a public engagement process in which climate was the driver of that conversation, because it wouldn't get us anywhere. We wouldn't be able to meet people where they are. We were asking people to meet us where we were, and that's not a particularly good way to do community engagement. So instead, what we did is we met with decision makers in the city, and we asked them a very simple set of questions that really focused on one fundamental thing. When does weather go from being a nuisance to being a real problem? And so each decision maker had a different answer for that, and they could answer it. So someone might say, in terms of operating our dam, when we have more than X amount of precipitation in 24 hours, we have tragic impacts. Like we start seeing overflow, we start seeing flooding. I'm really worried about whether the infrastructure can handle itself, et cetera. And the public health person might say this many consecutive days of temperatures not dropping below X degrees is too much. That's when we start to see higher hospitalization rates, homeless folks starting to kind of disappear off the grid, et cetera. And so we went around to the decision makers and we asked that simple question, and we got answers. And then we worked with a climate modeler, Catherine Hayhoe, and she helped us project how likely those different thresholds were to be exceeded into the future. And then we came back to the decision makers and we said, you know, it looks like if trends continue or if they get more aggressive, which we know they will through climate change, it's likely that those thresholds that you're worried about are going to be exceeded X number of times. And for every decision maker in this community, they said that's too many. We can't handle that much exceedance of these thresholds. We have to plan. And that led them into a climate adaptation plan that was only focused around thresholds, but in their case was really the gateway to this conversation. So it's just a different approach. And then two more examples I want to share with you. The other is a lot of what we're talking about, I've always struggled with because it's really, really negative, right? We're leading with how you are vulnerable. And that's just the truth of kind of this discourse that we're in. But there was also another way to frame this. And so this was an experiment that's still going on that we did between Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota, where they both were at the same point wanting to do a vulnerability assessment. And Minneapolis wanted to go through the kind of more traditional process where you think about sensitivity, exposure, adaptive capacity, how climate change will impact you, et cetera. But St. Paul said, we wanted to start in the positive. We want to start with a vision of what success looks like and why being resilient is so critical. And then we'll back from that vision. So everyone's in agreement and we're all inspired. And then we'll understand the different threats that could possibly impede our ability to get to that vision. And that's how you get climate change and sensitivity and vulnerability fully into the equation. But you start with an agreed upon vision of why all of that matters and where you want to go. And I really liked this approach because psychology tells us that we are so much more motivated by positive visions, especially when we see ourselves in some way, shape, or form in that vision, whether that's because we can see the future and we can see ourselves in it and we want to be in it, or it's we can help actualize and we understand the way we help actualize that vision. And so this is just a different way to start the conversation. They still went through all the same steps that Jason outlined, but they just started here. And then the last example I want to leave you with is Ann Arbor, right, where I'm sitting right now. And so here we have made an intentional decision not to create a standalone climate adaptation plan, but instead to mainstream climate change into pretty much all of the things that we do as a city. And I'll say, I think that's also a fine decision for people to make. There are many cases where a standalone plan makes a lot of sense. In other cases, the time and effort to create that standalone plan might be all you had in the bank, and so you don't have much left over to actually implement the plan. And only you know the context. So in our case, what we have decided to do is to integrate climate into a number of things, and two I'll highlight for you. One is we just updated our multi-hazard mitigation plan, and we've made sure that climate change is front and center in that document. So as we're thinking about threats and risks to the city, climate is not just one threat or risk to the city. We put climate as a lens by which we evaluated every threat and risk to the city. And if you don't do this in hazard mitigation planning, you are at very significant risk of being prepared for a future that doesn't exist because it's your past. Because hazard mitigation planning is based on the past, it's not based on the future. And so we fundamentally thought we had to bring climate into that discourse. The second thing that we are in the process of doing right now is climate change is being integrated into our capital improvements planning process. And here the idea is there's sort of, if you will, a gate that every project needs to go through, and we're working out the machinations of this. But basically, if you're putting any project forward through our CIP process, you've got to demonstrate that that project is prepared for the climate of the future. So if you're going to build a new water treatment plant in the city, and that water treatment plant is going to be in operation for 50 to 75 years, you need to demonstrate that you plan for the climate 75 years from now. Because if not, you've disinvested, right? And that's a poor investment of taxpayer dollars. So we're figuring out all of the data points. We're working with GLISA, the Great Lakes Integrated Science and Assessment, to pull together all of the projections. And again, the projections will be wrong. That's not actually the point. The point is to make sure we're prepared for a more variable future and an uncertain future. And so we're integrating climate in that way. And then the other kind of fun thing we're trying to figure out how to do is the Great Lakes region is likely going to fare much better than most of the US when it comes to climate change. And so that could very possibly mean in the not too distant future, more and more people are coming to our communities. And when that happens, is our physical infrastructure ready for that migration? Are our social systems ready for that migration? My instinct tells me no. And so we're going to try to work with some demographers to get projections of future climate migration into the region so that we can make sure that our infrastructure is not only prepared for the climate of the future, but our climate migrants of the future, so that we're ready for them when they come as well. So in closing, I just wanted to say, really what motivates me in this space is thinking about how we manage the unavoidable through adapting, right? Because climate change is here now. How we avoid the unmanageable through mitigation, because we can't stop mitigating. At some point, the impacts become so dire that we would suffer. And that how we do all of that through the lens of social equity, making sure we put people front and center in the work that we do. So with that, I'd say, again, there's a space for all of you at this table. Your journeys will be very different, and there are a lot of support infrastructure out there to help you. And I just thank you for listening and look forward to hearing your success stories over time. Thank you.
Missy, thank you so much. Both of these were really interesting presentations. One of the things I wanted to make sure to say is that if anybody on the phone thinks it would be useful to take a deeper dive into either some of the tools that Missy talked about, like ND-GAIN, or the other one that's name is escaping me right now, let us know, because we could arrange that. Or if you'd like more information about any of the other city processes that she talked about. I really appreciate the breadth of approaches that she showed, and we have plenty of cities in Indiana that have a hard time saying the word climate change and having a productive conversation. So we can sympathize with other cities that have managed to do this kind of planning without having to engage in those tense conversations. I know that a lot of these tools, especially for smaller cities, seem very daunting, very resource intensive, and really out of reach. And so we want to make sure that we're doing here at ERI whatever we can do to help those smaller cities find approaches and tools that are useful to them. One of the things that we're doing here is developing something called the Hoosier Resilience Index, which is intended to do some of the work that these other tools have done in terms of taking public information and doing a screen of vulnerabilities for cities in the state of Indiana and counties too. And we'll have more information for you as the spring goes on, and I think are planning a webinar on that topic. So that may be something that will be helpful for you. So I think we have one question in the chat box. Please be thinking of your questions, send them through chat, and we'll also open up the lines in a minute. So here's a question for Missy that says, I would be interested in the resources that were used to update Ann Arbor's stormwater model.
Yeah, I can send those over to you, Janet, if that's all right. I'll talk to our stormwater team. I didn't mention this, but that is true that we also used a bunch of climate information and some economic variables to update our stormwater, to recalibrate our stormwater model for the city, because the biggest impact that we face is increased precipitation for sure. So we just have to be prepared. But I'll pull that together and send it to you, Janet, and then maybe we can distribute it. Is that okay?
Yeah, yeah, that'd be great. I'm assuming that we have a way to reach people that have called in, or we'll post it online. I think that that's something that I hear a lot from cities, because it is so challenging to build forward-looking information into people's predictions and into these plans. So great question. So I think that's the only chat question we had. Orion, do you want to unmute the lines, and we'll see if people have questions they want to ask?
People are free to unmute themselves if they'd like.
Okay, you can also unmute yourself if you have a question that you'd like to ask. Well,
this is Therese.
Yeah, Therese, go ahead.
In South Bend.
Yeah.
I actually don't have a question, but I don't want Jason and Missy to think it's because presentations weren't helpful. I thought these are really fabulous, and vulnerability assessment has been something I've been struggling to wrap my mind around. And I thought both of these presentations made a complicated topic much more digestible. So I think I just need to sit with this information, but I feel so much more aware of what a vulnerability assessment is, and how it is different from a climate mitigation plan that I'm working on. So thank you very much for this information. I thought it was really well done.
Well, thank you, and we're getting some more kudos coming in through the chat. So I heartily agree, and that's one of the reasons that I mentioned that if it is a lot of information, we're all coming off of what seemed like an endless holiday season to me anyway. I don't know about you guys, maybe it's being in the academic setting, just things just completely shut down. And now it's 55 degrees outside in Bloomington, Indiana, which there's something wrong about that. So as people have a chance to digest this a little bit more, if it would be helpful to dive deeper into any of these things, just let us know, and we'd be happy. We can always do a one-off type of call to talk more about some of these things. Okay, one last call for questions. Unmute yourself if you want to ask something. All right, well, I don't mind ending early. Let me thank Jason and Missy very much for joining us today. I love this technology where we can get experts who don't have to travel and can share with us. Let me just remind people that we will be doing this again. We've been doing these webinars on Tuesday, but this is the last one that will be on Tuesday. Starting in February, the webinars will be held the second Wednesday of the month from 12 to 1 Eastern time, same bat station. Our next one is on February 13th at noon on using green space and vegetation as an adaptation strategy. We're going to have someone from the city of Gary talking about their experiences. We're also going to have Dr. Heather Reynolds, who is a professor in the biology department here at IU Bloomington, who has studied this extensively and worked on projects in the field. So I think that that will be a really good one. And then on the 13th of March, the topic is managing stormwater flooding, which should be timely as we're getting into spring, and people may be thinking about that a lot. So hope you'll be able to join us for those. We will have this recorded on the website, and we'll send out a link later this week, and along with any information that we receive from Missy. Orion, did you want to add anything? No, okay. All right, please let people know if you found this useful. The more people we can spread the word to, the better. And with that, I will thank you all for joining us, thank our speakers once again, and look forward to seeing you in a virtual way on February 13th, if not before. We're going to sign off, so thank you so much.
Thanks, bye.